Welcome. We are back at the Food 52 test kitchen, and today we are dealing with shrimp. The recipe we're making is called crystal shrimp with dragon well tea, which is a classic Hangzhou style dish. It's all about the preparation process. This technique, if not these techniques for dealing with shrimp, you can apply to almost any shrimp recipe. Here's what I hope that you take away from this video, is how we like to process shrimp to get nice, bouncy, delicious, flavorful shrimp. Okay, let's talk about shrimp first. So, this shrimp here is 7190 frozen shrimp that we've defrosted. First things first, for this recipe, traditionally, the shrimp that we're supposed to use is a freshwater shrimp, specifically a river shrimp. Those shrimps in China tend to be much, much smaller. And the reason why we use them is for their delicate flavor, but also because this is called a crystal shrimp recipe. We don't want that shrimp at the end to look orange. Depending on the diet, freshwater shrimp will come out a different hue after you cook them. So specifically the idea for crystal shrimp is that after you cook it, after you process it, and it's nice and glassy, both in texture in that it's crisp in a sense, but also the look, you should be able to see through it. This shrimp is not going to give us the same result because this is, number one, a saltwater shrimp, which means that it eats a lot of algae, which is going to give it that orange color, but it's also going to cook and become opaque. Nothing you can do about it if you don't have river shrimp. I will say, for all shrimp recipes, whether you use these techniques or not, if you don't have nice, fresh shrimp that's processed properly, you're not going to get delicious results. Frozen shrimp oftentimes is better than fresh shrimp that you buy because at some fishmongers, you'll find that fresh shrimp is actually just defrosted shrimp, or they've been sitting out for a little while. The best way to defrost shrimp, as is the case for almost anything else, is to defrost it at a slightly lower temperature, not room temp, but within the fridge overnight. That slowly bringing up the temperature of something frozen in a fridge allows it to retain its texture because you lose less moisture as that temperature comes up. I'm gonna add two things into this shrimp first, baking soda and salt. This is sort of our dry brine. As you can see, it's a huge amount of salt. It's also a huge amount of baking soda. But what we're going to do is we're going to massage it, and because it's a very quick 5-minute brine, we're going to be washing as much of this surface salt and baking soda off. Now, let me talk really quickly about salt and baking soda. Salt, really important for brines, helps lock in the moisture, helps season your protein, gives you really nice texture in and of itself. This works for chicken, beef, fish, everything like this. Baking soda, on the other hand, raises the pH of the shrimp and is actually the secret to making the shrimp really nice and glassy and bouncy. We cannot let this over brine. If you brine this for too long, it's going to be too salty, and there's going to be too much baking soda. The problem with baking soda at this quantity is this soapy, bitter flavor. It's really nasty. You'll spot it immediately. So, on the dot, 5 minutes, we need to rinse this out. Cold water, you're really rinsing this. Continually move the shrimp. In a professional kitchen, in Cantonese kitchens, we call this bei sui. So bei sui refers to the motion of the water. As you're moving that water around, yes, you're rinsing off the salt and the baking soda, but you also want as much surface area contact between the shrimp and the cold water as possible. And the final step. And the other thing I will say, handling this with your hands, it's bounce. Like it's bouncier than it was before. It's firmer than it was before, and that's a good thing. What you should end up with, nice bouncy shrimp that we're going to do one more thing to ensure its texture. And that thing is water velveting. So water velveting, really delightful technique. Very popular in Chinese cooking, specifically also Southern Chinese cooking. The idea is that you want to coat the outside of your protein with starch and egg white, and then you're going to pass it through either water or oil to seal in that outside coating. What does this do? First thing, it gives you a nice slippery texture. Starch has that ability to protect the outside during violent cooking methods such as stir frying, and by violent I just mean high temperature. And second, it gives you a little bit of that, what in Cantonese you call wat, which is silky or slippery. It's really a hallmark part of what makes dishes like beef and broccoli so delicious, because the beef, which could end up being overcooked and rough on the surface, end up being silky, slippery, and delicious. So in a bowl, we're going to add some egg whites, and let's just whip up these egg whites a little bit, just to loosen them up until they barely begin to foam. Second critical ingredient, starch. Get that in there. This is cornstarch today. Cornstarch is good, potato starch is better. Cornstarch is more likely available. And a little bit of Zhejiang wine, which is a Chinese rice wine, yellow rice wine. Classic ingredient for getting rid of gaminess by covering it up with a little bit of alcohol and floral sweetness. So shrimps go in, and we are going to be mixing this with our hands to coat every single piece of shrimp. Moving it around is going to really allow all those liquids to bind to that starch, which itself will bind to the surface of the shrimp. The water velveting mixture, the egg white has foamed. You can't feel any cornstarch between your fingers. It's really well mixed. That's exactly where you want it to be. Chinese chefs will also tell you that the cornstarch in here, after we poach it, is going to help clean the shrimp a little bit. And adding cornstarch actually is a typical way of helping you get a little bit of that grit out of that shrimp. We're going to be poaching these shrimps at a relatively low temperature, basically water velveting. So we're going to wait for this pot to come to a simmer. Water velveting works for almost any proteins. It's most commonly used for sliced meats like chicken, beef, and pork. Shrimp works great. You can do it for fish even, especially if fish is particularly flaky and you want to protect it during, let's say, a stir fry or something like that. Very common technique. The other thing I will say about velveting is that one of my favorite things about Chinese American culinary history is that water velveting is an English word that denotes a process that isn't exactly described in Chinese. What I mean to say is in Chinese, we don't say water velveting. We might say blanching, we might say marinating with cornstarch, we might say add an egg white in there and whip it up and then pass it through water, but there is no term that I am aware of that means water velveting. The first time that I know of that this term was coined was by Chef Irene Kuo in the 1970s. One of those amazing things that happens to understanding Chinese culinary techniques only via the export of that culture and that technique into another country. I will say, by the way, in most Chinese professional restaurants, we wouldn't actually pass through water and we would pass through oil. In a home cooking context, it's very similar in the results, in my opinion. But in a professional restaurant, oil a little bit more conductive than water, so you can, first of all, get the oil hot faster, and second of all, chefs are consistently reusing that oil for different purposes, so it's just a little bit more efficient for them. Now, in terms of boiling water itself, I want to show you something very fun. A little secret tidbit is Chinese chefs don't really often, to this day, use thermometers, and they like to tell the temperature of their liquids, specifically water and oil, with metaphors. The different temperatures of water before they reach a boil are described as shrimp eyes, crab eyes, and fish eyes. So shrimp eyes is the idea that you want to see bubbles the size of shrimp eyes. Roughly speaking, you're looking at something like 80 degrees Celsius for that. And then 90 degrees is sort of when it becomes a crab boil or a crab eye boil. And that's closing to 90, 95 degrees Celsius. And then fish eye boil is the size of fish eyes, which is right before that water comes to a full rolling boil. Knowing that, it's helpful with a little bit of experience to be able to look at a pot of water and know what temperature it's at without sticking a thermometer in there. Just a little bit of convenience. What I'm looking for here is for bubbles to come up to the surface, and they're kind of small-ish. In my experience, these bubbles form around 65, 70 degrees, and then they get to about 80 degrees Celsius, and you know you're at the right temperature. Caveat is, if the water's already been boiled, there isn't sufficient gas within the water itself for you to gauge what temperature it is. What we're looking for today, by the way, is around 80 Celsius, 175 Fahrenheit, shrimp eyes. The reason why we're poaching the shrimp is because we don't want to cook it at a rolling boil. We're not cooking it at a rolling boil because we don't want the outside to be tough before the inside is cooked. We're cooking it at a very low temperature, slowly bringing it up to temperature, slowly trying to get that shrimp to change color. Make sense? Okay, we're going to poach it now. Water's at the right temperature. We're going to lower the shrimp in there. We don't want to get all of that egg white and that marinade in there. We're also going to want it to get rid of it later, so. And we're looking at just a couple of minutes here. I'm just scooping off the stuff at the top so I can see what's going on. But on your regular home stove, you're looking at something like medium low. Slowly cooking it until the colors change and it's barely cooked. Keep in mind, this is going to cook one more time. This is going to get stir-fried, so we don't have to cook it all the way. Otherwise, it would end up being tough. So it's been about 2 minutes, and the shrimp now has changed color. It is orange. It's just a couple of minutes, but this is what you're looking for. By the way, I will say if I were a Chinese master chef, I would be yelling at myself because the shrimp that we purchased was already deveined via slicing the back, which is the most convenient way to do it, honestly. But it does change the shape of the shrimp, and it's not ideal for the most traditional version of this dish. Now that we've washed it, this is what barely cooked bouncy shrimp looks like. Actually, I wonder if it's gonna bounce. Okay, we just finished poaching the shrimp. Now we just have to cook it. Before that happens, I need to tell you about this dish. So this is a Hangzhou style dish in Chinese called longjing xiaren, which is dragon well shrimp. Dragon well is longjing, which is a type of tea that you see here. It's a green tea that is toasted by hand, made specifically in Longjing, which is a place in Zhejiang province, eastern China. It's a very, very delicate tea. It's quite difficult to grow. So there are a couple of things about this tea. Number one, because of how delicate it is, what I've been told by these tea farmers last time I was in Hangzhou was that any addition of pesticides will kill the plant. So unlike a lot of other types of tea, you can't add too many chemical additives to it during the growing process. A lot of people who drink dragon well tea don't rinse that tea before they brew it properly. Second of all, it's a very, very delicate tea. It's folded up naturally like this because of the toasting process. You have a guy in a pan. He's like slowly moving this tea around the sides of the pan to get them to this delicate texture and flavor. It's really sweet. It's really nice. It's really delicious. A second thing about dragon well tea is that because of the delicacy of the tea leaves, this is one of the few types of Chinese tea that is brewed without straining it. So the idea is that the tea leaves themselves are edible if you want to eat it. But when you're drinking dragon well tea in a glass, they don't strain out the tea leaves before you start sipping it. The history of this dish goes only back to the Qing dynasty. Like very many of our other favorite dishes, this is one of the dishes that has roots in the dynastic court. It's like a royal dish, it's a show-off dish, it's a technique dish, showing off how great we dealt with the shrimp and how nice the tea is. So just because we're going to be putting the tea inside of the stir fry itself and we don't want the tea to burn, we do have to activate it first with a little bit of hot, if not warm water. I am not brewing the tea now. I'm just getting the leaves to soften, but not quite open. Because once they open, they start to release all of that flavor. So just a couple of seconds. This is water that came to a boil that I then let sit for about a minute, a couple of seconds. Usually, brew time for green tea ranges between 2 minutes and 4 minutes. I know that's a huge thing, I'm not a tea expert. But now that it's softened, I'm just gonna pour this through. I don't want to lose all of that flavor. Okay, softened dragon well tea, not quite totally open. When they open, they are going to unfurl. But this is a good state for pre-stir fry. One thing I will say for this dish before we get going is you're going to need a little bit of oil just to stop your shrimp from sticking. You also want to give it a little bit of shine with that neutral oil. You can have salt and sugar on the side in case you need to season it, but in my opinion, the sweetness of the shrimp should come from the shrimp itself, and the saltiness is already in there because we did a beautiful dry brine. I'm going to have a little bit of water on hand just in case this sauce over reduces as my pan is too hot, but the only other seasoning is Shaoxing wine, again, our amber, yellow Chinese rice wine. If you get nice Shaoxing wine, specifically huadiao, it's going to give you a really nice sweet floral fragrance that's going to complement the shrimp itself. If you water velveted your other types of protein, say chicken, beef, or pork, I would not recommend doing this dragon well dish with it because the delicacy of the dragon well tea is not going to stand up to the intensity of those animal proteins. For seafood like shrimp, this is a perfect pairing. We're cooking at a relatively low heat for Chinese cooking. I'm looking for something like medium. Just a little bit of oil, about a tablespoon. And we're cooking in a beautiful pan that you can buy on food52.com. We're just looking for that oil to shimmer. Because we're cooking at a lower temperature, you don't necessarily need to use a wok. Of course, a wok is traditional. Something naturally non-stick is great. Shrimp's gonna go in. Toss it, get everything nice and even. Tea's gonna go in. Loosen it up a little bit. Deglaze it with Shaoxing wine. Get that alcohol to boil, cook some of it off, get it to reduce a little bit of sweetness. You can smell it, it's delicious. Just toss, and that's good to go. If at any point during this 5-second process, you realize that your pan is a little bit too dry, feel free to give it just a splash of water. Not too much, because you don't want to dilute that tea flavor. But you do need a little bit of liquid for that tea to activate. How does it smell? So good. Delicate, toasty tea. It's almost like, I mean, the tea is toasted in the first place, so it gets activated again in a hot pan. Nice dry on the bottom, a little bit of gloss from that oil, but it's a very, very simple dish. Food is done, time to taste. Actually, not that bad. I mean, I'm the least effusive person in the test kitchen. It's good. No, it's really good because it's super nice and bouncy. A little bit of bitterness from that tea, but mostly sweet, fragrant, floral. The wine just curbs everything. We didn't add a single pinch of salt to this during the cook process, but it's like perfectly seasoned through and through. I think this is the best way and my go-to way to prepare shrimp for any application. If you like recipes like this recipe can be found on Food 52. It's also in the description box below. There is a related dish that comes from the same region of Hangzhou called the velvet egg white. That is actually a mock crab dish, really interesting. Check that one out as well. Like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know if you use this shrimp technique for any of your shrimp recipes in the comments.